What if someone else beside you came to you and said, I want to make episode 7? Could you see that happening?
No.
No, absolutely, positively, you're really closing the door without any wiggle room whatsoever.
Right. There is no episode 7.
Even for someone else to come up with.
Well, there's possibility there may be another offshoot movie somewhere about an offshoot character in that world.
But not episode 7.
But not about Luke Skywalker, not about that group of people and that struggle to bring democracy back to the galaxy.
I remember a time when the notion of a Star Wars Episode 7 seemed like a dream. George Lucas openly said there is no Episode 7, but once Disney bought the franchise, that all changed. Disney announced not only a Star Wars Episode 7, but an entire sequel trilogy. And boy, did this trilogy end up being divisive. When there's online discourse about the sequels, rarely do people seem to argue about The Force Awakens. It's usually either intense disdain or praise thrown at The Last Jedi or The Rise of Skywalker. Why is this the case? Well, let's travel back in time to 2015 when The Force Awakens came out. Hello everybody and welcome to another video. My name is thegoldman and today we will be talking about Star Wars Episode 7, The Force Awakens, all these years later. On October 30th, 2012, Walt Disney Company purchased Lucasfilm for $4.05 billion. Now, to some, that may seem like a lot, but considering Disney bought Fox for like $71 billion, $4.05 billion doesn't seem like much. Shortly after the acquisition, Disney CEO Bob Iger immediately announced a Star Wars Episode 7 coming in 2015. At the time, this was mostly met with excitement. Star Wars was in a bit of a dry phase back then. Contrary to what revisionist history may say, the prequels were still relatively disliked at the time.
George Lucas raped our childhood.
So not only was the announcement of an Episode 7 exciting for a lot of people, but the idea that George Lucas wouldn't be directing was also exciting to some. Don't believe me? Go back in time and watch videos from 2012 to 2015 and tell me how much George Lucas praise there was back then. In early 2013, writer and director J.J. Abrams was brought onto the project with Michael Arndt set to write, and production began in late 2014. I remember this time as clearly as if it were yesterday. The excitement for this movie was unparalleled. Harrison Ford, Mark Hamill, and Carrie Fisher were confirmed to be returning, and a new cast of actors were hired for the movie too. When trailers for this movie were released, people went nuts. You can go back in time and watch compilations of grown men crying seeing Han Solo for the first time in 32 years. A major part of the marketing for The Force Awakens was pretty much that this movie was going to be everything the originals were and nothing like the prequels were. Abrams and his team put an emphasis on the notion of practical effects and less politics and great acting. Early on in the production of this movie, Lucas was originally a consultant, but decided to leave the project after he realized Lucasfilm was not too keen on having his ideas in their movies. As the movie approached release, its hype was starting to get out of control. Online ticket websites were crashing for the first time due to high demand. People would analyze every frame of the trailers just to get a hint of what was going to happen, and on December 18th, 2015, The Force Awakens released in theaters. Financially, the movie was a major success, becoming the third highest grossing movie of all time at the time of its release. And to this day, it is still the highest grossing movie domestically ever. That's right, even the widely popular and well-loved Avengers Endgame could not gross what The Force Awakens grossed domestically. Now, of course, just because a movie was financially successful, that doesn't mean it is automatically good. So how good or bad was The Force Awakens? Well, let's take a look. Even all these years later, it seems that the biggest issue people have with this movie in particular is that it's a simple rehash of A New Hope. That all the storytellers did was take the story of A New Hope, change a few things, make the main character a woman, and retell it in 2015. Now, it is undeniable that The Force Awakens does share heavy similarities to A New Hope. There's an evil bad guy in a black suit looking for a droid. The droid, which contains vital information, falls into the hands of a teenager in the desert. The droid and the protagonist run into Han Solo and Chewbacca. They go to a cantina, a giant superweapon blows up a planet, Han Solo brings the droid and the protagonist to a smaller rebel force, the final battle is trying to blow up a giant superweapon, the villain in black clothes kills the mentor figure, the movie ends with the superweapon being destroyed. When you phrase it like this, then sure, the movie seems identical to A New Hope. That is simply a really surface level analysis of The Force Awakens. I could easily twist the story of The Phantom Menace into sounding like a rehash of A New Hope, but let's go back to The Force Awakens. So yes, certain beats of A New Hope are replayed in The Force Awakens, and yes, Starkiller Base is pretty much a blatant ripoff of the Death Star. But besides that, and I guess having a droid hold important information, everything else is either a bit of a stretch or is just how opening stories in a Star Wars trilogy work. George Lucas studied Joseph Campbell in depth back in the 1970s, and based Star Wars heavily on Campbell's The Hero's Journey. The Hero's Journey is basically a formula that some of the most popular stories follow with their main character. Luke in A New Hope, Anakin in The Phantom Menace, and Rey in The Force Awakens all follow the hero's journey. Now, they don't do it all identically. Some of the characters I just mentioned go through the journey in a different order, but at the end of the day, they all follow it in some respect. So is it fair to say that Rey beginning her life on a desert planet is a ripoff of A New Hope? Is it fair to say that Rey having a call to adventure is a ripoff of A New Hope? Is it fair to say that Rey meeting an older mentor is a ripoff of A New Hope? And I could go on with a bunch of other points about Rey's story. So is Rey's story similar to Luke's story? Yes, but I feel it's disingenuous to say it's a rehash of A New Hope when it appears that the storytellers are just trying to honor the DNA of Star Wars. But moving on from the hero's journey, the simple plot of the movie is completely different. The plot of A New Hope is to destroy the Death Star. The plot of The Force Awakens is to find Luke Skywalker. Yes, they both involve protecting a droid that has information, but let's not act like the plots are the same here. The plot of The Phantom Menace, which is defeating the Trade Federation, is more similar to A New Hope than the plot of The Force Awakens is. Now, while this defends my argument that The Force Awakens is not a rehash, it also supports the point that the plot of The Force Awakens wasn't done so well. From the opening crawl of A New Hope, we know what the goal is: to destroy the Death Star. Every plot point throughout the movie builds up to destroying the Death Star. So when it does happen, it feels earned because that's what the whole story was about. With The Force Awakens, they spend pretty much the entire movie getting the location of Luke back to the Resistance, but when that happens, they learn about the threat of Starkiller Base. They take a 30-minute detour to destroy the base, then after the battle, R2 just happens to wake up from his nap, provide the final piece to the map, and then they go find Luke. The moment they find Luke is totally earned because the movie has been building up to this moment since the opening crawl, but the entire third act of the movie where they need to destroy Starkiller Base has nothing to do with finding Luke. It's just something that takes up time in the story. So in that regard, The Force Awakens is not a rehash of A New Hope because frankly, the handling of the plot was done worse. I wouldn't say it was awful, but when comparing it to one of the best movies ever made, yeah, it's not going to be as good. The next thing I want to talk about are the characters, because while The Force Awakens and A New Hope have characters that fill the same narrative archetypes, the characters themselves are radically different. Both stories have the reluctant hero, they have the droid best friend, they have the human best friend, they have the Dark Lord, and they have the old mentor. But let's not act like the characters that fill these archetypes in these movies are anything alike. Well, besides R2 and BB-8, they are pretty much the same character. Let's look at Rey and Luke. Luke was someone who longed for adventure, and once he had the chance to leave Tatooine, he never looked back. Yeah, he had questions about his family, but that never really hindered him going forward. Rey is frankly the complete opposite. Rey doesn't long for adventure, and throughout the movie, once she leaves Jakku, she's always finding excuses to get herself back there. Rey has questions about her family like Luke, but unlike Luke, those questions greatly hinder her. She runs away into the forest scared because she's told she will never see her parents again, and because she's being called for an adventure. Luke says he wants to learn the ways of the Force and become a Jedi like his father. When Rey is handed a lightsaber, she runs away. So yes, these characters are both kind, they both know how to fly, and they both become a Jedi, but let's not act like their stories are that similar in this movie. Now let's talk about the hero's best friend. In this case, it would be Han in A New Hope and Finn in The Force Awakens. Now making this comparison is a bit of a stretch anyway. Finn is clearly Rey's friend after they first meet, but I wouldn't say Luke and Han were friends until the end of the movie. Yeah, both Finn and Han have their own character arcs, which are actually kinda similar. Both learn to forego their selfish nature to fight for a cause, but I don't need to explain myself further to explain why these two characters are nothing alike. But I do want to talk about Han Solo for a second, because people love to point to him as a reason why The Force Awakens is a rehash. Luke ran into Han Solo and Chewbacca, and so did Rey. But Han in these two movies serves a radically different role. Han in A New Hope, as I said before, was kinda the best friend to the protagonist who goes on his own arc. In The Force Awakens, Han is the mentor figure who dies by the Dark Lord. Han in The Force Awakens is more similar to Obi-Wan in A New Hope than he is to his own counterpart in that movie. People forget that Star Wars is more so a mythology than anything. Sure, there are hundreds hundreds in books and comics that give Star Wars a rich and detailed history, but the Skywalker Saga movies will always be more of a mythology than anything else. And in mythologies, characters fulfill certain archetypes, which both A New Hope and The Force Awakens do. And the last character comparison is Darth Vader and Kylo Ren. These two characters couldn't be more different from each other. Darth Vader is a confident villain who everyone fears. Kylo Ren is a insecure villain who pretty much no one fears. Now, is it bad that Kylo Ren isn't a feared villain? We'll talk about that later. So the characters in this movie are fairly different from the ones in A New Hope. And besides that, there's some other minor things I can mention, like how The Force Awakens has a Stormtrooper turned rebel storyline, which A New Hope doesn't have. A New Hope has an entire act of its story to rescuing a princess, while The Force Awakens barely has a rescue mission, and The Force Awakens ends on a cliffhanger while A New Hope does not. I honestly feel, besides the existence of a super weapon, the biggest similarity these two movies have are the aesthetics. Both have TIE fighters, both have X-Wings, both have Stormtroopers, both have a desert planet, and they just look similar too. So yes, there is no doubt that A New Hope and The Force Awakens share a lot of similarities, but to say that The Force Awakens is a rehash of A New Hope is disingenuous and unfair to the story that J.J. Abrams and Lawrence Kasdan wrote. The world building of The Force Awakens is a problem. Rarely do you get opinions about the sequels that most people tend to share, but I think most people can agree that the world building in these movies were rather poor. Now, I think The Last Jedi and The Rise of Skywalker did some cool things world building wise, but this is a Force Awakens review, so let's focus on that. There's a common defense of the world building in the sequel trilogy that I find to be mildly frustrating, and it's that we didn't need certain things explained to us in the original trilogy, so why do we need them explained to us here? The most commonly used example with this defense is Snoke. Why do we need to know who Snoke is when in the originals we didn't know who Palpatine was? Let me give you an allegory as to why I disagree with this train of thought. If you walk into a hotel room for the first time and the walls are white, okay, the walls are white, you think nothing of it. Then you leave the room and come back 20 minutes later and now the walls are black. You would ask, why did the walls change color? Who changed the color of the walls? Why was the color of the walls changed? A similar thing could be said about certain things in the sequels. You don't ask these same questions with the originals because at the time we didn't know the status quo. In the case of Palpatine, we know there's two Sith, great, we think nothing of it. In the sequels, you can't just ask us to ignore why a dude who is basically a Sith just showed up out of the blue. We saw in Return of the Jedi that there were two Sith and that they both died. So the fact that there is a new dude who's pretty much a Sith raises questions that need to be answered. If The Force Awakens was the first movie in the Star Wars saga, then sure, this isn't a problem, but you can't have a movie titled Star Wars Episode 7 ask the audience to ignore what came before. Now, you could argue that this lack of a Snoke explanation is The Last Jedi's fault, fair enough, but similar examples could be said about a lot of things. In Return of the Jedi, we saw the rebellion beat the Empire. In The Force Awakens, there are now multiple factions. We learned there is a republic. Now, this is not something that needs further explanation. It's reasonable to assume that after the Empire was toppled, a new republic was formed. But then we are introduced to the First Order, and all that we know is that they rose from the ashes of the Empire. Are they the Empire? Are they a new organization? Did the Empire ever even fall? These are questions I feel should be addressed. And even worse, there's a resistance. If there's already a new republic, then why is there a resistance? What is their goal? Now, narratively, we know that J.J. Abrams and the writers just wanted to make the good guys the underdogs again. Fair enough. And again, if The Force Awakens was the first movie in the Star Wars saga, this wouldn't be a problem. But we saw the previous movie. We need to understand why these factions exist and what they're fighting for. In The Mandalorian, the Empire is still around. Why is the Empire still around? Because these Imperial factions are just remnants of the previous empire, and the New Republic has little interest in actually dealing with these remnants. In the first episode of The Mandalorian, we understand why the Empire is still around after it fell in Return of the Jedi, but The Force Awakens does not put in the time to clarify that to the audience. What's frustrating about this to me is that the lore behind the State of the Galaxy of the sequels is actually rather interesting. Similar to the Empire in The Mandalorian, the First Order is a former Imperial remnant. They went into hiding for around 25 years, and now they made a return to the galaxy. To avoid another galactic war, the New Republic decided not to engage and let the harmless First Order exist in the Outer Rim. Leia Organa, believing the threat of the First Order to be serious, formed her own organization called the Resistance to combat the First Order. For years, there was a cold war between the First Order and the Resistance until one day they fired Starkiller Base and left the galaxy with a power vacuum. Now, I find that to be a rather interesting backstory to the First Order Resistance conflict, but would you have any clue about that from the movies? No. Now there's more to world building than just the state of the galaxy. Do these worlds feel developed? Do they feel like real places? As I mentioned earlier, J.J. Abrams made a concerted effort to use practical effects to make the world look real, and I would say he was successful in that. The worlds of The Force Awakens look great, but I don't know if they feel real. Jakku probably is the most well-developed world. We got collapsed Star Destroyers all around. Many people scavenge these ships for parts to sell. Makes sense, but literally every other world in this movie besides, I guess, Hosnian Prime just feels like a desolate world with a minor hub somewhere. Jakku is a desert planet with this one little outpost. Takodana is this forest planet with this one little castle. Dakar is this forest planet with this one little base. Starkiller base is this snow planet with this one little base. So in this regard, all worlds that we visit feel pretty generic. And I can tell that the prop department created all these new types of aliens and pirates, but just because they are visually new doesn't mean that it feels like three-dimensional world building. Compare this to Jeddah City, which feels like an actual town. I just think that with The Force Awakens, there could have been more of an effort to provide us with unique worlds, something that I'll at least give props to The Last Jedi and The Rise of Skywalker. So all in all, the world building of The Force Awakens is incredibly lackluster. The storytellers got lazy in establishing the state of the galaxy, and the worlds that were created were bland and unoriginal. I want to move on to talking about the characters. First up, we have Rey, the supposed Mary Sue. Now, Rey is frankly a rather unpopular character, so if you're expecting this to be one of those videos where I shit on the character, then you're gonna be disappointed. And on the other hand, if you're hoping to find me praise everything about this character, then you'll also be disappointed. I like Rey as the protagonist of this trilogy. I do not think she is a bad character by any means. There's even a lot about her that I frankly love. No, I wouldn't say she's a great character, and there are plenty of aspects about her character that I do find frustrating and disappointing. So let's dive deep into this character and discuss some of the major criticisms of Rey, and I will either refute those criticisms or support them. Now, the single biggest criticism of Rey is that she's a Mary Sue. Now, what is a Mary Sue? Depending on who you're asking, people will have different definitions of a Mary Sue in order to support their arguments the best, but the textbook definition is a type of female character who is depicted as unrealistically lacking in flaws or weaknesses. And of course, what makes Mary Sue characters a problem are that they are hard for the audience to relate to. Human beings are naturally flawed, so if a character doesn't have any flaws, we won't be able to empathize with them. So is Rey a Mary Sue? Well, let's see. Rey's story begins with what I feel is a borderline perfect introduction. If you followed me for a while, you would know that I love it when a story can give us a great understanding of a character without said character speaking any lines of dialogue. Actions speak louder than words. What someone does is more revealing than what they say. So it's important for stories to show us what a character is like instead of telling us. This was a major problem I had with Jyn Erso in Rogue One. Rey's introduction begins with her on Jakku scavenging through a Star Destroyer. This introduction scene lasts around 6 minutes, and for the first 4 minutes of this scene, Rey doesn't say a single word. The movie decides to devote these 6 minutes into really fleshing out this character instead of just advancing the plot. In the first 4 minutes where Rey doesn't say a single word, the viewer already has a strong understanding of who Rey is and what her life is currently like. Let's list off everything we have learned about Rey before she says a single word. 1. She's a scavenger for a living. She goes to Star Destroyers, finds parts, and then sells those parts for food. 2. She's poor. She barely has any water to drink, she doesn't have much food either, and she lives in a non-functional AT-AT. 3. Rey is not happy with her life. She looks disgruntled when she is given her food for her work. She doesn't seem to have any sort of social life. The visual language of the scene tells us she's a loner, and she greatly fears being a scavenger forever. There's this moment in this scene where she's cleaning the parts, and then she looks at this old woman and gets distracted. I don't think the movie here actually did a great job of conveying Rey's fears, because there's actually a deleted moment that happens. After Rey looks at the old woman with great worry, then she looks out and sees a mother and son, I believe, showing some affection towards each other, and then she gets yelled at to go back to work. This is why, if you look closely, you can see Rey looks to the side at this old woman, then it cuts back to her looking straight ahead. I bring this up because this ties into another thing we learn. 4. Rey greatly misses her family. Now, this opening scene doesn't straight up tell us that right away, but the tallies on the wall of her home is probably the most important image of this first scene. We learn that she's been counting the days since something happened, and we learn later it was when her parents left.
I know all about waiting. For my family. They'll be back. One day.
And we can infer that these tallies are when her parents left. This is the most important part of her character, but more on that later. In 5, she longs to leave the planet. We get that through this one image of her staring off at the fleeing ship, and with her putting on her X-Wing helmet. So we learned these 5 things about Rey without her saying a single word. Now of course, this isn't enough to make her a great character, but it's a strong start. Now this video is not going to be me analyzing every scene that Rey is in. That would take way too long, as much as I would love to do that. But this opening scene is so great that I wanted to devote an entire portion of this video to it. Back to Rey. What is Rey's arc in this movie, and is it well conveyed? The Force Awakens as a whole is a movie about how characters deal with the trauma of their past. Each of the 4 characters I will focus on in this video resemble that idea. Rey's trauma is the day her parents left her. She counts the days since they've left, she tells BB-8 she's been waiting for her parents to come back, and she is hesitant to leave Jakku in the event that her parents will come back one day. Rey's flaw in this movie is her inability to cope with the fact that her parents are never coming back. So kinda the opposite of Luke. Usually great character arcs have a want, a need, and a flaw. I already stated Rey's major flaw. A want is the goal that the character wants to achieve, and the need is what they need to learn in order to achieve their want. Rey wants the stability of a family. The whole movie illustrates this in a multitude of different ways. One major way is her insistence on staying on Jakku. She tells this to Finn, Maz, and Han. Rey believes that the only way to achieve the stability of a family is with her parents. Even though she knows deep down that it is rather unlikely that her parents do ever return to her, she wastes her life away on Jakku because that's the only way her parents would be able to find her. How else do we see Rey's need for the stability of a family? Well, with her attachment to Han Solo. Once they meet, Rey clearly grows attached to him. They share some of the same knowledge, she looks up to him as a mentor, and she gets excited when Han offers her a job on the Falcon. This is something that Kylo Ren blatantly points out in The Last Jedi.
Your parents threw you away like garbage.
They didn't.
They did, but you can't stop needing them.
It's your greatest weakness.
Looking for them everywhere. In Han Solo, now in Skywalker.
So Rey's want is that she wants the stability of a family. Her flaw is her inability to cope with the fact that her parents are never coming back, and that the only way she can get the support of a family is with her parents. So with this information, Rey's need is that she needs to learn that you can have a family and find belonging outside of just your parents. This is what Maz tells Rey in her castle on Takodana, that Rey already knows the truth. Whomever she is waiting for on Jakku is never coming back.
Whomever you're waiting for on Jakku, they're never coming back.
This greatly upsets Rey and she runs away. This is why Rey refuses to take the lightsaber from Maz, and why she wants to go back to Jakku. If Rey accepts the lightsaber and the duties that come along with it, then she's accepting that she won't ever go back to Jakku and that she likely will never see her parents again. This is a big flaw, and one I find to be totally relatable. Rey's struggle to find belonging and her purpose in her life is so Star Wars at its core. Now, I don't share the same experience with Rey and her abandonment issues, but what I do share is the longing to find your place. And because of that, I empathize with Rey on a deep level. So that's probably why I like Rey a lot more than most. At the end of the movie, when Rey takes the lightsaber from Kylo, it's not just her standing up for herself in the fight, it's her also accepting that she will move on from Jakku and start her journey elsewhere. Now at that moment, most viewers aren't thinking to themselves that Rey is overcoming her biggest flaw here, but to me that's what I see, and it's a powerful moment of acceptance. So Rey has a clear arc in this movie. She begins it believing she can only find belonging with her parents, and by the end of the movie she accepts that the journey to find belonging is elsewhere. Now just because she goes through a character change, and just because I frankly love the message that her story conveys, that doesn't automatically mean she has the best arc ever. I feel the biggest problem with Rey, and this is what I think a lot of people really dislike about her character, is that she doesn't ever suffer the consequences of her flaw. Throughout the entire movie, we see Rey's flaws firsthand, but only once does it result in something negative, and that's when she ran away into the forest and then got captured by Kylo. So that was a good moment of showing her flaws have consequences, but it needs to happen more than once. And again, I really think this is why so many people dislike her. In this whole movie, she always seems so skilled at things, which is fine, but she almost never gets hurt physically at least, and she never suffers any major defeats. Luke and Anakin both suffered clear consequences of their flaws. Luke got mollywopped by Vader in The Empire Strikes Back, and Anakin got burned alive and lost many limbs. I think if Rey suffered some consequences of her flaws, then there wouldn't be such a backlash to her character. Now, I do think there's a difference between her suffering consequences and her being weak in the Force. A lot of people point to Rey's skills with the Force as her biggest Mary Sue attribute. I would have liked it if Rey struggled a bit more with the Force, sure, but I don't think what was shown she could do in this movie was overpowered by any means. She often gets compared to Luke, and fairly so. Rey is clearly better with the Force in her first two movies than Luke was in his first two movies. But the reason isn't because Rey's a Mary Sue and Luke isn't. Remember how I said character flaws should greatly negatively impact the character? Well, this is the case with Luke. Luke's greatest flaw in the first two movies was his inability to trust in himself and in the Force. Luke struggles with the Force because he doesn't trust himself. So Luke's flaws in the original trilogy have a direct correlation with his strength in the Force. With Rey, that isn't the case. She not once doubts her skills or her strength with the Force, and because of that, she's able to learn things faster than Luke. I'm sure if we saw Anakin training immediately after the Phantom Menace, he would be seen as way stronger than Rey. A big part of the Force is believing in yourself. Rey and Anakin believe in themselves and Luke doesn't. So because of that, it doesn't bother me that Rey is so strong with the Force. Also, what she does in this movie isn't that impressive. Like, she lifts a lightsaber, which is a basic of a Force skill as there is. She does a Jedi mind trick, which frankly isn't a challenging thing to do in the Force. It's been shown to us that entering someone's mind is actually one of the first things a Jedi can learn. And the two other things she gets criticized the most for are her beating Kylo Ren in a fight and her flying. I'm gonna have a whole portion of this video discussing the third act of the movie, so I'll address her beating Kylo Ren later. But here I'll discuss Rey's flying because frankly this is the criticism that triggers me the most. People sarcastically say that Rey is the best pilot in the galaxy and that she is such a Mary Sue. For one, in this entire trilogy, Rey only flies in combat once, and that's in the beginning of The Force Awakens. Literally every other time she flies, she's just going from point A to point B. So apparently Rey's flying skills in this one scene are ridiculous. She's unnecessarily so great at flying. Let's see what she actually does. Because for like the first 2/3 of this sequence, all she's doing is crashing into things. Literally just look at the way she takes off. After that, she's pretty much flying in an open field, avoiding 2 TIE fighters. And unlike Luke and Anakin, she's not even responsible for shooting down the TIE fighters. She has Finn for that. Yes, for like 20 seconds, Rey actually does some impressive shit. She navigates through the Star Destroyer and does that badass flip at the end. I think a lot of Star Wars fans have a fundamental misunderstanding of the Force. Even untrained Force users can use the Force in the most basic way. Having inhuman reflexes is the single most basic Force skill. This is what Qui-Gon points out in The Phantom Menace. And just because a Force user has no training, that doesn't mean they don't tap into the Force. Literally in dozens of different mediums in Star Wars, we see untrained Force users subconsciously using the Force. In the case of Rey, she's using her immense reflexes when flying. So am I surprised that Rey can navigate through a Star Destroyer or do this crazy flip considering she has the Force? No. But even if her 20 seconds of impressive flying was enough to make her a Mary Sue, you cannot say that Luke and Anakin are not Gary Stews, which is the male form of a Mary Sue. Let's compare the three. Anakin is 9 years old, he won a pod race without even in his life completing one, and then he went into space never actually having flown a starship before and accidentally blew up the Trade Federation ship. So that's pretty impressive. Luke never flew an X-Wing before, managed to survive a battle where almost every X-Wing and Y-Wing pilot died, and managed to make a shot without a targeting computer that supposedly is a 1 in a million shot. In my opinion, not as impressive as Anakin, but still impressive. Rey flew a ship she clearly has done some work on. She even has said as much. She manages to survive an engagement against 2 TIE fighters and does like 1 impressive flip. Please tell me how on earth Rey is unrealistically good at flying when Anakin and Luke are not. But Goldman, you are using whataboutisms to defend Rey. Yes, I am, because there is a clear double standard for Rey that people don't seem to understand exists. So that is my argument for defending Rey's flying. There are 2 other criticisms that I want to address. One has to do with her knowing more about the Falcon than Han, and the other has to do with her personality. So does Rey know more about the Falcon than Han? No. But Goldman, she fixed a problem with the Falcon that Han couldn't figure out. Well, you aren't listening carefully. When Han is first back on the Falcon, he points out that a compressor was added. What is a compressor? I don't know, but it was added and Han doesn't like it. Rey mentions that Unkar Plutt, this fat dude, added the compressor. Every time Han is struggling with the Falcon, it's because of this damn compressor. How would you feel if I took your phone from you and reorganized all the apps on the home screen? You'd be lost for a second and I would be able to help you. This is the same thing with Rey and Han. Rey knows about this stupid compressor, Han does not. So no, Rey doesn't know more about the Falcon than Han. And the last criticism about Rey is that she has no personality. This is a bit more subjective, impressive, but I disagree. Rey's kind of a dork. She knows a lot about technical things, about ships and stuff, and even gets excited when she bypasses the compressor. She also has this cute, nerdy look when Han tells her that Chewie likes her. She's also really sensitive. She cries a lot in this movie and in the whole trilogy, frankly. Rey is a caring person, clearly shown with her relationship with BB-8. One small detail that's in every sequel movie is that she's always checking BB-8's antenna, which is really sweet. So yeah, these are just some of the small things that I've noticed. Is Rey the most well-developed character in the world? Not even close. But there's enough for me there to appreciate her. But I do get where people are coming from when they say she really doesn't have any personality. So is Rey the best character in the world? No. I wouldn't even say she's a great character. But a lot of the complaints about Rey I find to be completely unfair. Rey is a character that I love quite a bit, but I also fully acknowledge the many faults with her character and how it could have been improved. Next, we got Finn, the Stormtrooper turned Resistance hero. One opinion that most people probably share is that Finn's best movie was The Force Awakens. Now, what went wrong with his character in The Last Jedi and The Rise of Skywalker is a topic for another day. But to summarize my main problems into one sentence, Finn in The Force Awakens is a co-protagonist with Rey, while in The Last Jedi and The Rise of Skywalker, he is a supporting character. A good way to gauge how important a character is how much time the story spends with them alone. I don't care how close you are with someone, a person is never truly themselves when they are around other people. Stories give the viewers a chance to see a character when they are by themselves. What are they thinking? What decisions do they make? A character trait that is important to have in a character that I didn't really talk about with Rey is that your character is an active character. This is something I discussed in depth in my Rogue One video. But in short, an active character is a character who makes decisions that push the story forward, and a passive character is a character who lets things happen to them where the story pushes them forward. Jyn is a passive character because she lets things happen to her and doesn't often make her own decisions. Rey is kinda a passive and active character. We see her make important decisions like saving BB-8 and standing up for him too, but a lot of the story is about events happening to her. Finn is an active character. Finn's actions are what push the story forward, not Rey's. Finn made the decision to defect from the First Order. This was not something he had to do. Finn made the decision to help BB-8 and Rey get back to the Resistance. Finn made the decision to lie to Rey about his identity. Finn made the decision to lie to the Resistance just so he could save Rey. These decisions help us learn about his character and what kind of person he is. And because Finn is making decisions that push the story forward, he is seen as a protagonist of the story, something that is lacking in The Last Jedi and The Rise of Skywalker. Now, what is Finn's arc in this movie? As I stated earlier with Rey, The Force Awakens is a story about how different people deal with the trauma of their past. Rey dealt with her trauma by wasting her life away on Jakku in denial. Finn deals with his trauma by running away from his past. Finn defects from the First Order, and every decision he makes for the first 2/3 of the movie are his efforts to try and get away from the First Order. He steals a TIE fighter and leaves. He goes to the Millennium Falcon to try and escape Jakku. He hitches a ride with Han Solo to get to the Resistance base. He tries to leave Takodana with some random people so he can escape the upcoming war. What do all these moments tell us about Finn? Well, that he's a coward. He'd rather run away than face his problems head on. Everything changes when Rey is captured. Now, I know it is kind of memed at this point that Finn is obsessed with Rey, but at least in this movie and in The Last Jedi, it makes sense. Finn really only has two friends, Rey and Poe, and he spent far more time with Rey than he did with Poe. So do I blame him that he's trying to save the one person in the galaxy he can call a friend? Probably not. So Finn goes back to Starkiller base, entering the heart of the First Order just to save his friend. And when the two of them are in the Force together and Rey gets knocked out by Kylo, Finn does something he hasn't done in the entire movie. He doesn't run from the First Order, he stands up to it. Kylo Ren in Finn's mind is someone who embodies the First Order. He took up the lightsaber and charged at him. Finn, for the first time, is fighting for something. He is fighting for Rey. This is what Finn's arc is about in this movie. There's a big misconception about Finn's story in The Force Awakens, and it tends to lead people to disliking his story in The Last Jedi. Finn's arc in The Force Awakens is not about learning to fight for the good guys. It's about learning to stop running away from your past and fighting for something. Not once in The Force Awakens is there any indication that Finn is helping the Resistance because he believes in their cause. He only helps during the Battle of Starkiller Base so he can save Rey. He literally says as much when he's talking to Han.
And how do you know how to disable the shields? I don't. I'm just here to get Rey.
So come The Last Jedi, it makes sense that he's trying to bail on the Resistance to help Rey. He wasn't being a coward in The Last Jedi, he was just trying to help his friend, not run away from the First Order. So that is what Finn's arc is about in The Force Awakens. One aspect about Finn, and frankly Rey too, that I absolutely love is how in this movie they are essentially in the same shoes as the audience. Pretty much every person who saw The Force Awakens for the first time was aware of the legacy of Star Wars. We all know who Han, Luke, and Leia are. We all know who Darth Vader is. We all know what happened in the original trilogy and how these characters are seen as heroes to the viewers. If any of us saw Harrison Ford in real life, we would geek out. That is exactly how Rey and Finn feel. These two are newcomers to Star Wars. Nothing exciting has really happened to them before. So when they meet Han Solo for the first time and they get excited and nerd out, it's exactly how we would feel if we met Han Solo. When they go to the Resistance base for the first time and Finn is just looking around, this is exactly how we would feel. A powerful storytelling technique is to have your viewpoint characters express the same emotions as the viewer. This way it is easier for us to empathize with the main character and put ourselves in their shoes. So that was really something I loved about Finn and Rey's story in The Force Awakens. I feel like there's not much else to say about Finn. Finn is a kind person who is quite funny at times and quite clumsy at other times, but there is no doubt that The Force Awakens gives him a story to go on where he makes active decisions. And that is why of all the movies in the sequel trilogy, The Force Awakens is the one that depicts Finn the best. Up next, we got the mentor of the story, Han Solo. One of the few things that was planned for the sequel trilogy was that each of the original trilogy trio was going to get their own movie, if you will. Episode 7 would focus on Han, Episode 8 would focus on Luke, and Episode 9 would focus on Leia. Now, unfortunately, Carrie Fisher passed away before filming Episode 9, so we never got to see that. But Han and Luke each got their movies. The biggest criticism of Han in this movie is that he became a deadbeat dad. After his son turned to the dark side, he ran away with Chewbacca and became a smuggler again. Is it disappointing that Han didn't stick with the Republic and become a general? Sure, but it is incredibly realistic that given what happened to Han, he would go down this path. The way I have always depicted someone turning to the dark side is kinda like the old person dying. So when Ben Solo became Kylo Ren, I always imagined Han and Leia treated it as if their son died. Yeah, Han and Leia kinda split up, but it's not like Han and Leia had a nasty divorce, they probably just needed to spend some time away from each other. The expectation that Han would become some sort of Republic general I find to be rather unrealistic. Han was also a smuggler and a scoundrel. He was thrown into the rebellion and only helped because he was a good person. There's nothing to suggest Han loved being a general in the rebellion. Also, let's be real, Han getting promoted to general in the first place makes no sense. He was a part of the rebellion for 3 years and all of a sudden he gets promoted to one of the highest positions? Totally unrealistic. And it's not like Han abandoned Leia during a time of war. The galaxy was in the middle of a 30-year peace. Han Solo doesn't seem to be the type of guy that would stay involved with the military after the war was over. He did his job, he helped save the galaxy, and he moved on with his life. This is why right after Hosnian Prime was destroyed, he went back to the Resistance to help them. So those are my thoughts on Han supposedly regressing back into his worst self. Now, I don't think a lot of people have a problem with the way Han acted in this movie. Han seems to be exactly like the older version of Han that we knew. The only other major criticism about Han is that he died for nothing. I need to bring up The Rise of Skywalker here because in order to determine if Han died for nothing or not would depend on the future movies. Han went out on that bridge in The Force Awakens to try and save his son. Han likely knew that there was a good chance he would die trying to do this, but it didn't matter to Han. It was more important to him that he at least tried to save his son, and in doing so he was murdered and Kylo stayed on the dark side. So initially it may seem like Han died for nothing, but The Rise of Skywalker changed that. I'm going to talk about this a bit more in depth in a few minutes when I talk about Kylo Ren, but in short, murdering his father was something Kylo thought would make him stronger with the dark side, but that clearly didn't happen. Han's death was something that haunted Kylo all throughout the trilogy. And in The Rise of Skywalker, Kylo plays this moment back in his head, and because he mentally gives himself a second chance to do the right thing, he does it and redeems himself. So because of this, Han didn't die for nothing. If Han never went out on that bridge in The Force Awakens, then Kylo would have never turned back to the light side in The Rise of Skywalker. So to say Han died for nothing is simply false. Han Solo's story in this movie sticks speaks to the theme of dealing with a traumatic past. How did Han deal with his son turning to the dark side? Well, he went back to what he knew best, and that was smuggling. But at the end of his story, he overcame his trauma and confronted his son. Even though he died, I still find his arc to be beautiful. I understand a lot of the problems that people have with Han in this movie, but frankly, I love every second that he was on screen, and I totally disagree with the notion that The Force Awakens ruined Han Solo. The last character that I will focus on is the mighty Kylo Ren, Ben Solo. I love this character so much, and it's not really a hot take to say he's the best character in the entire trilogy. So let's take a look at him in The Force Awakens. The concept of this character was brilliant. You are making a sequel trilogy to the most popular movie trilogy ever made. The villain of said trilogy is arguably the most popular villain ever put to screen. How in this new trilogy can you create a character that is as iconic as Darth Vader? Well, you can't. It doesn't matter what kind of villain you would create, it doesn't matter what their personality would be or who played that character, said character would always be compared to Darth Vader. The writers of The Force Awakens were totally aware of this, so what did they do? They made the character in the universe feel the weight of Darth Vader's shadow.
You're afraid that you will never be as strong as Darth Vader.
Again, they knew that whatever they created would never live up to Darth Vader. So what if the character himself tried his best to live up to Darth Vader, but would ultimately fail in every way? To me, that was so genius because now there's no need to debate who's a better villain between the two. The story itself acknowledges that Vader is better, and the story uses that as the crux of Kylo Ren's character. So brilliant. Now, the idea of the son of Han and Leia turning to the dark side isn't an original one. In the old expanded universe, the son of Han and Leia, Jason Solo, turned to the dark side. Now, I know absolutely nothing about Jason Solo, his story, or what he was like. All I know is what Kylo Ren is like. The root of all of Kylo Ren's problems has to do with the past. Kylo Ren's #1 goal in these movies is to bury his Skywalker bloodline. He wants to form his own identity and remove himself from any attachment he may have to the past. This is actually very common in people that have major familial issues. Oftentimes, just in spite of a person's family, they'll become the very thing that the family hates the most to distance themselves. Kylo is thinking to himself, my family were the heroes of the rebellion and are symbols for good? Fine, I'm gonna become the face of the new empire and a symbol for evil. And this is the crux of the inner conflict within Kylo. Ben Solo is not an evil person, but he wants to be so bad, and we see that throughout the trilogy. But why? Why does Ben Solo want to be so evil? Why does he hate his family so much? The main cause of Kylo Ren's descent into darkness is his relationship with his parents. Ben Solo was once a happy child, a boy who loved his mother and father. According to the Last Jedi Visual Dictionary, Ben Solo wanted to be like his father. He idolized Han Solo. But the first incident that led to the fall of Ben Solo was when his parents sent him to train with Luke. Leia in The Force Awakens tells Han this.
I just never should have sent him away. That's when I lost him.
And Kylo tells Rey this in The Last Jedi. From his own words, Kylo feels like his parents threw him away like garbage. Leia had sensed the growing darkness in young Ben Solo, and she felt what was best for him was to send him to Luke. While we see it as a mother and father trying to help their child, Ben Solo saw it as his parents being scared of him. Ben Solo didn't want to go to Luke. He wanted the love of his parents. But to him, his parents saw him as a monster that needed to be shipped off to Uncle Luke. I genuinely believe that Ben Solo doesn't want to be evil, but after so many people, including his parents, saw him as evil and as a monster from his point of view, one day he just snapped. Ben Solo was more so pushed to the dark side than he did fall on his own. Palpatine and Snoke definitely gaslighted him for years and groomed him for years. After all his mentors saw him as a monster, the only one who accepted him was Snoke. So by the time of The Force Awakens, his family has caused him so much pain that he wants nothing to do with them anymore. This is where his struggle with the light side comes in. Deep down, Kylo Ren knows his parents love him, and deep down, he loves his parents. But he was so hurt by them, he uses the dark side as a way to cure his pain. This is why he wants to let the past die. The only thing that's keeping him from fully committing to the dark side is his family. If he can kill the past, then all that pain will be gone. At least so he thinks. Some of you may say I'm reaching here when talking about Kylo. Fair enough, but this is honestly what I get from watching these movies. I love the depth that was added to Kylo's character. So tying this all back into the theme of the movie, Kylo Ren's trauma is his experience with his parents. The way he deals with that trauma is turning to the dark side and doing his best to hide his Ben Solo identity. When we see him in the beginning of the movie, he is gone full-on Vader fanboy. He wears an entire black suit and, more importantly, a mask. Some critics look at Kylo Ren's appearance and say it is an obvious ripoff of Darth Vader, but there is so much more to that. Kylo wears this outfit because he wants to suppress Ben Solo as much as he can. He believes if he can act like Darth Vader, then he can become as entrenched in the dark side as he was. But as we see, Kylo Ren is no Darth Vader. In Kylo's first scene, he runs into a man he clearly knows from his past. He's trying to get information out of him about the whereabouts of Luke, but all this old man does is bring up his connection to his family. Finally, Kylo Ren has had enough and he rashly kills him. This was a stupid move by Kylo. For all he knows, the old man is the only person who knows where the map is, and now he's dead. In reality, he's lucky Poe showed up. But remember, Kylo Ren wants to kill the past, and this man knows everything about Kylo Ren's past. So while stupid, it is entirely in Kylo Ren's character to murder this man. Moments like these are why I think people love Kylo so much. He's one of the most complex and layered villains I have ever seen in a blockbuster movie. There are so many scenes with Kylo that I could talk about, but the one I want to focus on is the moment where he kills his father. I believe this scene right here with Han's death is the most important scene in Kylo Ren's story. For the first time in how long, Kylo is confronted with his father, the person he once loved so much, but also the person who has caused him so much pain. Scenes like this truly show how great of an actor Adam Driver is. Some may say that Kylo is like Vader, but he is infinitely more akin to Anakin. We saw this in Anakin and we see it in Kylo. When they are on the dark side, there's this rejection of the person they once were. Kylo Ren is trying to bury Ben Solo, so he says things like your son is gone and Ben Solo was weak. When Han is on the bridge with him, I don't think Kylo knows what he's going to do. Yes, he wants to kill his father, but for him that is a very hard thing to do. Kylo Ren's attachment to the light brings him pain. At least that's how I read the scene. In that moment, he believes that if he can kill his father, he will be fully entrenched in the dark side and that pain will go away. And he goes through with it. For a moment there, I think it worked for Kylo. I think he felt fully entrenched in the dark side when he said thank you. But what happens next, when Han touches his son's face, is the single most important moment in Kylo's story. I think Kylo wants his parents to hate him. If his parents don't love him, then it would be easier for Kylo to be on the dark side. For the longest time, Kylo has felt hurt by his parents. He thinks they see him as this monster and that's why they shipped him off to Luke. In the last moments of Han's life, in his last moments as a father, Han doesn't show anger or hate towards his son, he shows him love. Han is basically telling Kylo, I may be hurt, I may be disappointed, but you are my son and there is nothing you can do to make me stop loving you. And in that moment right there, you can tell Kylo knew he made a mistake. The face he makes afterwards is not a face of evil or relief, but a face of pain, a face of regret. If Han didn't touch his face, I think Kylo would have never turned back to the light side. The worst thing happened to Kylo. Kylo thought his parents didn't love him, but even at his worst, his father still loved him. Kylo realizes he was wrong, and everything he thought he knew about his past was wrong. Kylo Ren is the best character in this movie because he's the one who's the most layered. We understand who he is and why he is so conflicted, and what drives him to be the man he is. Also, there's just something about the dark side that is so fascinating to viewers. Adam Driver added so much to this character that even people who hate the sequels kinda like him. The last portion of this video that I want to focus on is the Battle of Starkiller Base. If you guys have watched my previous videos, you know that I love analyzing battles, because a lot of people think that making a great battle is just good action, but that isn't true. The Battle of Starkiller Base is pretty much split into two parts: the aerial battle with the X-Wings and Poe, and then there is the lightsaber fight. We'll look at the aerial battle first. Of all the space battles in Star Wars, the Battle of Starkiller Base may be the most forgettable. Part of me wants to say the space battle in The Phantom Menace is the most forgettable, but since there are so many prequel fans today, that's probably not the case. So what makes this space battle so forgettable? I mean, the CGI is great, there are plenty of good shots, the goal of the battle is simple, so why is it so forgettable? Before we answer that, let's answer what makes a battle memorable. In a battle, you want there to be plenty of mini narrative beats. Each of these beats should contain a moment of victory for your heroes and a moment of defeat for your heroes. And usually these victories will come from the good guys accomplishing some goal. Let's look at the Battle of Scarif, which I think is one of the best space battles ever put to film. The rebels first must successfully land on the base. Then they must cause a distraction so Jyn and Cassian can get the plans. Then they fight off the Empire. Then the rebel fleet arrives, which causes the Empire to close the shield gate. Then the rebels must make communication with the rebel fleet. Then they must flip a master switch. Then they must transmit the plans. Then they must destroy the shield gate to receive the plans. Then they must deliver the plans to Leia so they can leave. believe. Everything I described here is a narrative beat during the battle, and these moments all contain victories and defeats for our heroes. What keeps an audience member engaged in a battle is the contrasting emotions that stem from seeing our heroes win and lose. If you have the same emotion throughout a battle, then you will be bored. But if you jump from being hyped to being scared to being relieved then to being sad, you will tend to remember the battle more. The Battle of Starkiller Base barely has any of this. The X-Wings arrive trying to blow up the oscillator, they realize they can't do it, so then they send Han and Chewie to blow up a hole for them, then Poe enters the oscillator and destroys it, and boom, Starkiller Base was destroyed. Did you feel a strong range of emotions here? No. Also, all the characters that we care about are currently involved in a lightsaber fight, and we don't really care about any of the other characters that are in this aerial battle. And also, destroying Starkiller Base was way too easy. Think about all the things the rebels had to do on Scarif to transmit the plans. That was like 10 mini battles they had to win in order for them to win the big battle. In this movie, the Resistance had one obstacle and that was it. It's also simple biology. The longer and harder it is for something to be accomplished, the greater the feeling of satisfaction when said thing is accomplished. Also, it doesn't help The Force Awakens that this is now the third time in a Star Wars movie where the goal is to destroy a super weapon by shooting a small specific thing a few times. So do me a favor, the next time you're watching a battle that really has you hooked, ask yourself how many mini battles were there in the larger battle and how hard was it for the heroes to accomplish their goal. I'm sure you will notice that what I said will come to be correct. Moving on from the boring ass space battle, let's talk about the lightsaber fight. I wouldn't say I love this lightsaber fight, but I do thoroughly enjoy it. We need to start the discussion of this lightsaber fight by addressing the elephant in the room. How was Rey able to beat Kylo Ren in this duel? Let's take a look at Kylo Ren. Kylo Ren killed his father. He felt immense guilt for what happened. Han puts his hand on his son's face, which is Han's way of saying no matter what you do to me, I will always love you. And this moment here will haunt Kylo for the next 3 movies. A dark side user is at his or her strongest when they are committed to the dark side, when there is no conflict and they are able to embrace the darkness. Kylo Ren is conflicted more than he's ever been. This face is not the face of someone who has embraced the dark side. Kylo Ren knows that he has essentially weakened himself. Because of this, his wound is not feeding the dark side, but it is hindering him. The novelization even flat out states that Kylo Ren is struggling because of Chewbacca's bowcaster shot. And yes, I know the novelization is not the movie, I just wanted to bring that up. So how is Rey able to beat Kylo? Well, the same exact way Luke was able to defeat Vader in Return of the Jedi. Do you guys really think a Luke Skywalker who trained for 1 year is able to defeat the damn Chosen One in a lightsaber duel? We are talking about Darth Vader. But there are 2 main reasons why Luke was able to defeat Vader. 1, Vader was emotionally compromised. He is currently wrestling with the fact that there is still good in him and that he has a son who loves him. Remember how I said earlier that Kylo Ren wasn't as strong with the Force because he wasn't committed with the dark side? The same applies to Vader. The other reason is because Luke is feeding the dark side. The first half of this fight is kinda a stalemate when Luke is just his usual self, but once Vader threatens Leia, Luke 100% embraces the dark side and goes off on Vader. This is how the Force works. It doesn't really matter how much lightsaber training you have, if one person is conflicted and cannot embrace the Force and the other is fully embracing the dark side, the person who is embracing the dark side will pretty much always win. The same applies to Rey and Kylo Ren. Kylo Ren is conflicted and cannot embrace the dark side, but Rey is feeding the dark side. She doesn't really know she's doing this, she doesn't have an understanding of what the Force is, so at the moment she's just feeding her anger. But even with this all said, Kylo still has the upper hand for like 90% of this fight. For a minute or so, I want to talk about the visuals and the directing of this fight. So many Star Wars fans love to talk about the story of the movies, and while the story is definitely the most important aspect of a movie, the way fights are filmed and composed is fairly important too. The contrast of the bright lightsabers with the snowy night was such a brilliant decision from the cinematographer. When filming this duel, J.J. Abrams wanted to make sure that the lightsaber props that were used would actually glow the proper color. This way, when the light was reflected on each of the actors, it wasn't artificial light added in post-production. The glow on the actors is real light coming from the lightsabers. This was such a genius decision, I wish people gave J.J. Abrams more credit for this. Also, when it comes to the directing choices of this fight, J.J. Abrams may not be a great writer, but he is certainly a great director. J.J. uses wide angles all throughout this fight, so the viewer has a great look at the action. The only time he gets up close with the camera are moments where the tension is at a high. Close-ups should be used to highlight the intensity of a scene, not to mask poor stunt work. Since Star Wars has been well known for having well-shot lightsaber duels, it's kinda expected that a lightsaber duel is shot well. Really, only the Attack of the Clones fight was was poorly shot, so I'm gonna give JJ and his team some props here. Moving back to the fight, it is clear that Kylo Ren is in control. After the movie cuts back to the fight, Kylo is chasing Rey down all the way until the point where they're on the edge of the cliff. Now, it should be noted that for this part of the fight, if Kylo Ren really wanted to, he could have killed Rey. Rey is kind of losing her grip on the dark side here, and that has allowed Kylo Ren to take the upper hand in this fight. But Kylo does not want to kill Rey. Remember, he is fascinated by her. When they're on the edge of the cliff, Kylo says, "You need a teacher, I can show you the ways of the Force." So Kylo didn't defeat Rey because when Rey was at her weakest throughout the fight, Kylo was not trying to kill her. When Rey is backed up against the edge of the cliff, a memory sparked in her head when Kylo says the Force. First, I have to say, the visuals here are fantastic. The way the lightsaber glows on Rey and Kylo's face was such a stunning visual to include in this movie. Anyway, Rey closes her eyes and thinks back to her conversation with Maz Kanata. At this point in her life, all she knows about the Force is what Maz told her, to close your eyes and feel it. Rey closes her eyes and feels the Force. Granted, Maz was talking about the light side, and what Rey feels is the dark side. Remember how I said it was Vader threatening Leia that made Luke finally embrace the dark side? This moment is what led Rey to embrace the dark side. Rey moves away from the edge of the cliff and starts hammering Kylo with blow after blow, just like what Luke did with Vader. At this point, Kylo is overwhelmed. He simply cannot keep up with the rising darkness in Rey. Just look at the shots of Rey that JJ chooses to highlight. There are all moments where Rey looks angry. She looks like someone using the dark side of the Force. The two press up against each other, holding the lightsabers. Since Rey is fueled by the dark side, she's able to physically overpower Kylo and hold his saber down. Of course, one of the most iconic shots of this movie is the blue lightsaber raised above the red lightsaber, symbolizing good defeating evil. Although it is a bit ironic considering Rey is using the dark side, but anyway, this is still a great shot. Rey disarms Kylo and then slashes him in the face. And this one shot of Rey triumphant is a clear representation of her embracing the dark side. And then the fight is over. So that's my analysis of this fight. I don't think it's unrealistic that Rey was able to beat Kylo given the circumstances. The fight is also well filmed, which a lot of people don't appreciate. So to summarize the Battle of Starkiller Base, the space battle was pretty boring and is probably one of the most forgettable moments in Star Wars. But the lightsaber fight is one that I appreciate and find to be criminally underrated. So, Star Wars Episode 7 The Force Awakens, all these years later, what will this movie be remembered for? Surprisingly, it is still the highest grossing movie domestically ever made, but even then, the movie seems to live in the shadow of the divisiveness of the next two films, even though I enjoyed this movie a lot. One aspect of it that really bothers me was Disney's approach to the movie. All three sequel films have an element of a strong reaction to what came before. In the early 2010s, the prequels were widely hated, so The Force Awakens tried to avoid anything that would remind viewers of the prequels. After The Force Awakens came out, people kept on saying the movie wasn't original. So The Last Jedi tried its best to do something completely new. People said The Last Jedi didn't feel like Star Wars to a lot of people, so The Rise of Skywalker tried to bring back elements of Star Wars that people loved. This is a terrible approach to filmmaking, and I hope Disney doesn't do it again. The Force Awakens rejuvenated people's passions for Star Wars. Regardless of what revisionist history may say, this movie was mostly well liked at the time of its release. Some people look at this movie as the movie that started a new era of Star Wars. Some see this movie as the movie that set up immense potential before The Last Jedi shat on it. And some people say this movie was the start of a dark period in Star Wars. I'll let you guys decide what this movie means to you, but to me, it will always hold a special place in my heart.